Well, welcome to CCV this weekend. I want to do something before we start. I just think it's incredible that God, in all of his divine just nature, would choose that 1 year to the date, the anniversary of this crisis we went through last year. This weekend, CCV, we get to launch our 11th campus, CCV Queen Creek. Can we welcome CCV Queen Creek this morning? We love you guys. And we're so excited for what God's gonna do through this Queen Creek campus. And if you know anybody in that area, please invite them. I think it's gonna be an incredible, incredible launch. To start this series today, I want you to go back to your childhood. Okay, just go back to your childhood for a second. I wanna ask, how many of you, as a child, either planned to or you did run away from home? Anybody out there? Yeah. Most of us either packed a bag, had a plan. Some of you actually did it. I'll never forget when I was 8 years old, I was so fed up with my parents, right? I was so fed up. I mean, I'd had enough. They probably made me eat my vegetables that night again, and I'm an 8-year-old grown up man. I shouldn't have to do that. I'm out of here. So I literally had a plan. I went in my room, and that night, I began packing up my stuff, and I had this little Superman, backpack. I put some clothes in, a flashlight, and I was out of there. I'm sick of this, And the problem is that my dad walked in and caught me packing. It was really late at night, and he's like, "What are you doing?" And I was like, "I'm running away from home, And he's like, "Where are you gonna go?" Well, I hadn't thought that far ahead. I had no idea, So a few, tears later and a hug, I got my little butt back in bed, But I asked my kids this week, I have 3 kids, I asked all of them, I said, had you planned to run away at some point when you were younger? And all of them said yes. All of them said yes. Only one of them did, our middle child, all right? We love you, middle children. And what she did is she packed up, and unbeknownst to us, she ran away, and she got as far as across the street to her aunt's house. And she was moving in. So when we found out, we went across the street and we made her come back home. And she was so livid at us when we made her come back home. She posted a sign outside of her door. She made this sign herself, and we took a picture of it. We still have it. I'm gonna see if I can show you if you can see what this sign looks like. It's a really mad face, and it says, "No moms allowed." This is misspelled allowed here. And then this is the best part to me. She says, "If you do, I will call the POLEES. I will call the police on you," right? And I'm thinking go ahead, I dare you, It's she just ran. I mean, we all have our running stories. Aren't you glad that when we become adults, we outgrow this? No, there's part of us, it's just inside of us, right? We kind of like to run. And today we kick off a brand new series looking at what Charles Dickens said is the greatest story ever told. It comes from Luke chapter 15, and in your Bible, it's the header, or what you've heard it called before, is it's called a couple things. It's called the parable of the lost son, or oftentimes the prodigal son story. But I want you to know right up front, it is a gross mistake, a massive mistake, to believe that this is a story about just one lost son. In fact, when Jesus starts the story in verse 11 of chapter 15, let me just show you what Jesus said as he started the story. He said there was a man that had what? Say it out loud. 2 sons. And what I hope you see by the end of this series is that this story is probably more accurately called this, the parable of the 2 lost sons. Because there were 2 sons, and both of them got drastically lost. But I'm getting ahead of myself, all right? Throughout this series, 3 weeks leading up to Easter, we're gonna look at each character in the story, the younger son, the father, and the older brother. And I'm gonna promise you something in this series. I don't care how many times you've heard this story. If you've never heard this story before, I'm gonna promise you 2 things. One is you will learn something new in a really powerful way. And 2 is, I really believe God may use this series and this story to transform someone's life here today. The story of the 2 lost sons. Let's start at the beginning where just Jesus started. why he told the story in the first place. I think this is really, really important if you really want to understand this story well. Why did Jesus tell the story in the first place? Luke chapter 15, starting in verse 1, gives us the context. Here's what it says. Now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus. In other words, every single time Jesus went about his life, when you read through the Gospels, it's amazing. He was always gathering a crowd. A crowd was always getting around Jesus. And so, sometimes I hear people in church say, well, I don't really like being around crowds. I'm like, you'd hate being around Jesus. You would have hated it. He always had a crowd. And in the crowd were always what's called sinners and tax collectors. That simply means the worst of their society. In our environment, Phoenix, think Seahawks fans in Phoenix, okay? Think that, all right? It's just the worst of the worst, all right? Kidding you, Seahawks fans. But we just have to know this is the environment. And I love what this verse says. It says they were all gathering, and that is a specific, present, progressive tense Greek verb that means this didn't happen once, this happened all the time. Jesus was always gathering around him what was considered the worst of the worst in his society. And it just convicts me to my core when I read that. Because here's how I think about it. How did Jesus, the only perfect person in all of human history, manage to always attract notoriously imperfect people? I mean, how did he do that? And I think in my own heart, I'm like, I am far from perfect, but as a pastor, do people far from God want to be around me? Do they want to be at our church? I mean, do they want to be here? Because that's the environment that Jesus created. And when I think about that, I get convicted because I think I have some work to do. And especially when I get around people that are not Christians or far from God, I think I have some work to do as a pastor because many of them have assumptions about how a pastor's gonna treat them based on how they've been treated in the past or how a church mistreated them or maybe just their assumptions of what they've heard. And so I always feel like I have some work to do to really be like Jesus in this area. I'll just give you an example from my personal life. Many of you know I like to play golf. And what I've done the past few years is I've tried to get a little more strategic. And when I go out to play golf, I won't just play with people I know all the time. Oftentimes when I go out as a single, I'll just join 3 people that I have no idea who they are. And what this does is God always intersects me a lot of times with people that either are, want nothing to do with the church, want nothing to do with Christianity, would never, ever step inside the foot of a church, and I love it. It's been such a great opportunity for me to hang out with, be around people that would not even want anything to do with Jesus. But what happens almost every single time is something like this. Okay, I feel like I'm fun to be around, right? So we're having a great time, and I'm trying to. It's just fun. I love playing golf, and we're out having a good time. And holes 1 through 4, what'll happen almost inevitably is a few people in the group will hit some bad shots, and then it just kind of comes out, right? I'll hear something like a son of a beep, right? And you'll hear mother beep. It's just out there, and so we're playing, and then it always happens on hole 5 or 6. I don't know why. It's always holes 5 or 6. Someone will say to me, Ashley, what do you do for a living? And it's like I tell them, and all of a sudden you could hear a record. It's just like, and their eyes get big, and people start apologizing. I had one couple, the wife's like, I've been telling him for years to watch his language and clean it up, And it's just so funny. So, to make them feel better, my next bad shot, I just drop an F-bomb for them. Okay, that's what I do. I'm kidding, I'm kidding, okay? I don't hit bad shots, all right? So now you're like, the pastor's lying, right? Right, I am. But seriously, I wanna change the narrative. I wanna change the narrative where people that are really, really far from God feel comfortable being around and wanting to be around a follower of Jesus. That's the model Jesus shows us. And so I just need to let you know here at CCV, you need to know when we make decisions around here, we don't always make decisions through the lens of what's gonna make all the Christians happy. We can't. We have to continue to reach out to a lost world. How are we ever gonna see our city transformed if they don't feel comfortable coming and wanting to be a part of church where they can hear about Jesus? How could that would ever happen? And that makes some Christians mad because they think it should be all about them. They think the church should be a country club for Christians versus a hospital for sinners. And I learned this a lot watching our founding pastor Don lead for so many years. He was always making decisions not based on who we're trying to keep, but based on who we're trying to reach. I'm telling you, that makes people mad. And guess what? It did in Jesus' day too, so that's okay. Because the very next verse, when Jesus was welcoming tons of sinners around him, listen to the response of the religious elite. Next verse it says, but the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, these are all the religious people, they muttered, they complained. Well, I don't like this music. I don't like that program. They need to do what I want to do. I'm complaining because look, this man welcomes sinners around him all the time, and he eats with them, which is a massive sign of like, I love you, I want to be around you, I accept you. This was the response. And so Jesus, when he saw the response of the religious people, he was so disgusted at it, he told 3 parables in a row to get up in their grill. And the greatest of those parables that he told, the third one, was the parable of the 2 lost sons. And I just want to read it to you. I want to summarize it in a way that maybe you can just hear this in a fresh way today, no matter how you've heard it before. Luke chapter 15, starting in verse 11, Jesus continued, there was a man who had 2 sons, and the younger son said to his father, Father, give me my share of the estate. So his father divided this property between them, and not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, and he set off for a distant country, and there he squandered the wealth on wild living, and we find out later it was on prostitutes and who knows what. After he spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need, and so he went and hired himself out to a citizen of the country who put him to work feeding pigs, the lowest of the low in a Jewish society. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, remember that line, when he came to his senses, he said, how many in my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death. I know what I'll do. I'll go back to my father and I'll say to him, Father, I've sinned against you and against heaven. And Father, I know I cannot be your son anymore. I know I can't. But would you just hire me as like a hired servant? But while he was still a long ways off, coming back home, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. And he ran to his son, and he threw his arms around him, and he kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, he's rehearsed the speech the whole way home. Father, I've sinned against you. I know I can't be your son. His father just stops him. Stop. He puts a robe on him and a ring, a symbol of immediate acceptance back in being his son and completely being back into the family. And then the father throws the biggest party that village has ever seen. And as the party's going on, the older brother is out working in the field because he's Mr. Perfection. And so he thinks. He hears the party and he gets so upset. He's disgusted that the father would accept the son back in. The father goes out to try to bring him into the party, the older brother, and he says, no, Dad, I've worked for you my whole life. You haven't given me jack. You haven't given me a party like that. His dad says, son, everything I've had has always been yours. And then the story ends on a cliffhanger. We don't know what happens with the older brother. But today, what I want to do with this story is I just want to zone in on the younger son. We'll talk about the father and the older brother in the weeks to come, but I just want to talk about this lost son. And I want us to look at how we're a lot like this lost son. If you're taking notes, here's, I think, the first way we're like the lost son. All of us know this about our lives. We've all run from God and we've done something scandalous. We have, all of us have. I have. And when we read this story, we think, well, what was so scandalous about what the lost son did? I mean, he just kind of went away and like wasted a little bit of money. And we have to look at this story not through our American lens, but we have to look at this story through the lens of how Jesus' first century audience would have heard it. And you need to know, this story was crazy scandalous. I mean, beyond. When Jesus would have told this story, people would have gasped. They would have freaked out, especially when Jesus said that the younger son went to ask for his inheritance from his father while he was still alive. People would have gone, oh! Everyone would have gasped. Why? Well, let me just show you why. There's a Middle Eastern historian and missionary named Kenneth Bailey, and he writes this. He says this, in all of Middle Eastern literature, aside from this parable, this one instance, from ancient times to present, there is no case, none, ever, of any son, older or younger, asking for his inheritance from the father who is still in good health. Now, what would happen in that society is that the father would have passed down his inheritance when he died, 2/3 to the older son, who became kind of the new leader of the family. He got a double portion, and then 1/3 to the younger son. But the thing is, in that culture, never, ever would someone ask for the inheritance while the father was still alive, because to do that was to do what? It was to ask and demand that the father be dead. You were asking for your father to die. Father, I don't love you for who you are. I only love you for what you can give me, and I want it now. I wish you were dead. In fact, Kenneth Bailey did this. He spent 40 years in the Middle East. He said this, I've traveled all across the Middle East, from Morocco to India, from Turkey to Sudan. I've been walking into villages in the Middle East and asking the same question all these years to thousands of people. And here's what I've said. Has anyone ever made such a request to have their inheritance while the father is still alive? And every single person across the Middle East in every village said this, never. That has never happened. He said, could anyone make a request like this? Impossible, he was told. He said, if someone did, what would happen? And everyone said this, the father would beat him and disown him, because that was a request for the father to die. When I see that, I get convicted because I think, how many times have I wished that God was dead? How many times have you potentially wished that God was dead? You're thinking like, what do you mean? Well, when we tell God, God, you don't have any demand on my life. You don't get to tell me about my sexuality, my morality, my finances. You stay away. What are we telling? We're saying we wish God was dead. And in many ways, I think in a way, this is kind of where our culture is today. It's where many of us are today. We've been running and we don't want God to pour into our life or say anything into our life at all. We just wish he was dead. In fact, earlier this year, someone sent me the top 10 most watched videos on YouTube this past year. And I was watching them, and one of them just stopped me in my tracks. Literally, I just stopped. Because what this person said, and this video has been viewed over 36 million times, this person was describing why they're making the decisions they are and how they want to live their life. And they said this, I'm just gonna quote exactly what they said. They said this, they said, I want to be my own person, my own identity, my own human being, and I want a life with no rules, no labels, and no restrictions. That's the kind of life that so many people want. I think that's exactly where our culture is. I want no rules, no restrictions. No one gets to tell me to do anything. And we're just running. And again, in this story, the son ran to a distant land because he thought, well, then I'll have no rules, no restrictions. I can do whatever I want. Thought it was gonna make him happy. And our running doesn't look like a distant land. It might mean that you ran to Vegas. It might mean that you look back and that was your freshman year. That's spring break. You remember that? It could have been the affair. It could have been the addiction. It could have been when you ran, or right now are running from your wife to pornography. It could have been the financial mistakes you made. It could have been that time in your life that you went off and purchased the Harley without asking anybody. It could simply be right now that many of you just don't even feel like you need church at all. You're running. You sit at home in your pajamas. You're not in the church. You're not part of the church. You're not contributing in the church. You're just doing your own thing. I love what Henry Nouwen said. He said, I am the prodigal son every time I search for unconditional love where it cannot be found. And so many of us are searching for something and it cannot be found there. Now, why do we run? Think about this. Why do we run? This is the second way I think we're like the lost son. We run because we think God's restricting us, right? So what we just talked about, we think God is gonna hold me back from all the fun I want in life. So I want no rules, no restrictions. That's how you have a happy life, which sounds awesome until it's not. I mean, sometimes I hear Christians say, well, sin's not fun. Sure it is. You kidding me? In the moment, if you don't think sin's fun, you're not doing it right, all right? Sin can be incredibly fun in the moment, but then you have to deal with the consequences. And the consequences put you in a pit with mud, with pigs. And when we live that kind of life, where we do our own thing, because it feels fun in the moment, and then we have to deal with the consequences later, which always lead to destruction, you can end up in a place you never thought you'd be. Haven't we all done that? Haven't we all ended up in a place that we never thought we'd be? That's where some of you are right now, right in this moment. You're like, I don't even know how I got here. It's just one step, doing your own thing, running away from God, because you didn't want any restrictions. You didn't want him to say anything about what you were doing, and you didn't want advice from anybody else around you. So when we run, and we're a lot like the lost son in our lives, we run all the time. What do we learn about God when we run from this story? I think there's a few things. Let me just tell you what I think we learn from God. One is, I think when you run, you just need to know God won't always stop you. God will let you run. You're thinking like, well, why wouldn't God stop me from all this? No, you're making a decision. God will let you run away. Why? Because he loves you. Do you understand you cannot have love without the freedom to accept or reject? Think about if you're in a marriage or a relationship right now, would you want that person to lock you in a house and not let you out ever? That's called slavery. God loves you so much, and the power of love is the power to either accept or reject someone. So God wants to have an adventure, a relationship with you. A real relationship requires that you have to accept and choose to seek God. And if you choose not to run, God will let you run. And guess what? He'll let you run, and here's what you have to know. The second thing, God won't always shield you from the pain of your choices. Now, many of you are in pain because someone else made a really, really bad decision, and I'm sorry. And someone's hurt you badly, and I'm sorry for that. But can we just admit today, many of us, we're in the situation we are right now because of our choices. And we're dealing with the pain of those choices. And God will not shield you from the pain of your choices all the time. In fact, many times God will let you run and exhaust yourself because you're on a treadmill and you think the one thing you need in life is more of what you already have. That's exhausting. No, the one thing you need is to turn back to God and to say, God, I'm tired of doing it my way because this has put me in a pit. I want to do it your way. Are you tired? Are you tired of running? When you get tired and you know that life is not going the way you want, why is it that it takes us so long to turn back home? You ever thought about this? Why does it take us so long? In the story of the prodigal son, why did it take him so long to actually realize? He's feeding pigs. It doesn't get any lower than that. Why didn't he immediately just go back home? Why does it take us so long to finally turn back? I think there's a lot of reasons, and for you, it could be that you think God's mad at you. He won't accept you back. But I think there's one word that describes why it takes us so long to turn back home, and here's the word I think it is. It's shame. Many of us feel so much shame. We're just not sure we'd ever be accepted again for all the things that we've done. And when Jesus told this story, everyone in the audience would have known exactly why it took the lost son so long to come back home. And the reason it took him so long is because in Jewish law at this time, and everyone would have known this, we have to understand this to understand the story. In Jewish law, the Talmud at the time, there was a Jewish law that said this: if a son got his inheritance, this was after the father died, and he went off and wasted the inheritance with Gentiles, in other words, on wild living, he wasted it all. If he ever tried to come back home, they would perform a ceremony to show him all the shame and cut him off completely. And here's what the ceremony is called. Okay, if you want to look this up, it's called kizeza. Can we say that out loud? It's just kizeza. Say it out, it's kind of fun, just say it. Kizeza. You say, what is that? Here's exactly what the ceremony was. If a son ever tried to come back home after shaming the family, wasting his life on wild living, the Talmud said that the whole village would take a pot, Maybe it looked something like this. They'd fill the pot with the most putrid smell you could ever think of. It was burnt nuts and corn and just things that stunk like crazy. And then when the son was trying to come back home, the whole village would come out and they'd meet him with the pot, and they would hold the pot in front of him. And what they would do is the son was trying to come back home, they would throw the pot in front of him like this. And it would shatter, and the smell would fill him, and the brokenness would be evident to him. And then the whole village would say this: "You are cut off forever." And it was a ceremony designed to shame him and to show him that he is never accepted again for what he's done. And I think that's how maybe some of you feel. You think for what you've done that God has a vase with your name on it. And if you ever came back, he's too ashamed. People are too ashamed for you to ever make a decision to come back home. And that's why so many of us wait. And maybe what someone needs to hear today for the very first time, and this could be your takeaway, is this: if you've been running, listen, God does not see you as broken. He sees you as loved. You're his child. But you will never, ever overcome your brokenness until you come home to his love. You never will. In fact, the scandal of this story is that the father not only welcomed his son, he ran to his son. And everyone in Jesus' audience would have known that's what should have happened. And God shows us another way. And so what I want to do for just a moment is I want to invite our bands on the stage from every campus, and I want to read you a story that I think summarizes exactly who God is and what he thinks about you. This comes from a book written by Philip Yancey called What's So Amazing About Grace. In the book, he writes the story. A young girl grew up on a cherry orchard just outside of Traverse City, Michigan. Her parents have been old-fashioned. They tend to overreact to her nose ring and the music she listens to and the length of her skirts. They ground her a few times and she rages inside. "I hate you," she screams at her dad after a big fight, and he comes knocking on her door that night. That night, she acts on a plan that she's rehearsed 1,000 times. She decides to run away. She's visited Detroit only once on a bus trip with her church group to watch the Tigers play, and because the newspapers in Traverse City report shocking details of gangs and drugs and violence in downtown Detroit, she concludes that's the last place her parents will ever look for her. Her second day there, she meets a man who drives the biggest car she's ever seen, and he offers her a ride, buys her lunch, arranges a place for her to stay. He gives her some pills that make her feel better than she has ever felt before. She was right all along, she decides. Her parents were keeping her from all the fun. The good life continues for a month, 2 months, a year. The man with the big car she now calls boss, and he teaches her a few things. Since she's underage, men pay a premium for her. She lives in a penthouse. She orders room service whenever she wants, and occasionally she thinks about her family back home. But their lives now seem so boring she can hardly believe she grew up there. She has a brief scare when she sees her picture printed on the back of a milk carton with the headlines, "Have you seen this child?" But at this point, with her blonde hair and with the makeup and body piercings, no one would mistake her for a child. After a year, the first signs of the illness appear. And it amazes her how fast the boss turns mean. Before she knows it, she's out on the street without a penny to her name. Still, she turns a couple tricks at night, but they don't pay much. All the money goes to support her habit. When the winter blows in, she finds herself sleeping on metal grates outside the big department stores. Although sleeping's the wrong word, because a teenager at night in downtown Detroit can never relax her guard. Dark bands begin to form around her eyes. Her cough worsens. One night she wakes up and she's lying, listening for footsteps, and all of a sudden, everything about her life looks different. She no longer feels like a woman of the world. She feels like a little girl lost in a cold and frightening city. She begins to whimper. Her pockets are empty. She's hungry and she needs a fix. She pulls her legs tight underneath her and shivers under the newspaper pile that's piled on top of her coat. She jolts, and a memory fills her mind. It's a single image of being back home in May when all the millions of cherry trees blossom at once. And she says to herself, God, why did I ever leave? Pain stabs her heart. My dogs back home eat better than I do right now. She's sobbing, and she knows in a flash that more than anything else in the world, she wants to go home. It's the cry of her heart now to go home. 3 straight phone calls. Twice, she hangs up. The 3rd time, she leaves a message for her parents. Mom, Dad, it's me. I was wondering about coming home. I'm catching a bus up your way. It'll get there around midnight tomorrow, and if you're there, well, I'll guess I'll stay, but if you're not, I'll just stay on the bus and keep going to Canada. It takes about 7 hours for the bus to make all the stops between Detroit and Traverse City. And during that time, she realizes the flaws in her plan. I mean, what if her parents were out of town and they never even got the message? I mean, should she have waited another day so she could have talked to them? And even if they are home, they've probably written her off as dead long ago. She should have given them more time to process and overcome their shock. I mean, her thoughts bounce back and forth between those worries and a speech that she's been preparing for her father. Dad, I'm sorry. I know I was wrong. It's not your fault. It's mine. Dad, would you forgive me? She says these words over and over to practice them, but they tense up in her throat every time she does. I mean, she hasn't apologized to anyone in years. When the bus finally rolls into the station, the driver announces in a crackly voice over the microphone, 15 minutes, folks. We will only be at the stop for 15 minutes. "15 minutes will decide the rest of her life." She checks herself in her compact mirror. She pats down her hair. She walks into the terminal not knowing what to expect. Not one of the 1,000 scenes that have played out in her mind prepare her for what she sees next. There in the bus terminal in Traverse City, Michigan, stands a group of 40 brothers and sisters and great aunts and uncles and cousins and grandparents. They're all wearing goofy party hats and blowing noisemakers, and taped across the entire wall of the terminal in computer-generated paper is the words, "Welcome home." Out of the crowd of well-wishers breaks her dad. She stares, tears quivering in her eyes, and she begins to give her memorized speech, "Dad, I'm sorry," and he interrupts her immediately. "Hush, child, we've got no time for that. There's no time for apologies. You're gonna be late for the party that's waiting for you back home." We've been waiting for you to come back home. If you're standing, you can have a seat just for a moment. The story of this lost younger brother is really the story of a homecoming. And I hope if you're here today and you've been running, I hope you know that God won't just take you back. Like we just sang, He will take you all the way back. And He will begin to give you the life that you've always dreamed of, but it has to include Him. And so I want to just challenge someone here today that has been running. If you've been running, it's time to come home. In fact, in 3 short weeks, we'll have our Easter services, and the theme of Easter is welcome home. And if you've never taken a step to follow Jesus, to invite Him fully into your life and to be baptized, I want to challenge you to take that step. And to take that step, you can simply text the word baptism to 72020, baptism to 72020, and we'll give you all the details on how you can sign up to be baptized. And I think there's no better time to be baptized than on Easter. It is the culmination, the celebration of everything Jesus did for us to welcome us back home. So if that's you, would you be bold? Would you text baptism? If you have any questions, we can answer those for you. We'd love to talk to you even today. But some of us today, we have been home. We've made a decision to follow Jesus. We've been baptized. But I want to ask you, when's the last time that you invited someone that you know is far from God to come home? When's the last time you've sat in church with someone right next to you that needed to come home? And if it's been a while, you know that. I'm going to challenge you to not come to Easter alone. Every single person here, every person at CCV, we've given you these Easter invite cards. I want to challenge you to take one of these home and you use this to make sure that you do not come to Easter without someone that needs to come home. And I promise you that God will impact their life and he'll impact yours in the process, because we were designed to be like Jesus, welcoming people home all the time. And that's why we exist as a church. All of us here today, you either need to come home or we need to invite someone to come home. Let's pray together. Father, thanks for a story that is so inspiring and also yet so convicting. So many of us have been like the lost son. We've been running, and I pray for those that are running right now that you would give them the boldness and courage to just make a decision to follow you and to get baptized. And God, if someone has been running away, would you just help them know there's no shame? They will not find shame coming back to you. They'll find love. But I pray for all of us here today that we would be just motivated and inspired to welcome more people back home, to invite people to come with us to a place where they can really hear who Jesus is and follow you. And God, do a mighty work as we live this out in our lives, this story. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. CCV, I love you. I can't wait to celebrate with you next weekend as we continue the series. Have a great weekend. See ya.